for joining me today. This is the Kuali Research webinar for case study successfully migrating to Kuali Research in the cloud. And today we will be joined by Steve Dowdy. He's the Director of Research Systems and Integration at the University of Maryland. You may know Steve from his many years working with COIAS and that community. He's often referred to as the father of COIAS because he began that project initially way back at the University of Houston and then worked at MIT with the COIAS project. Then over the years, he implemented the new Kuali research version at MIT, as well as in the last 2 years, he's been working with the University of Maryland on their project. So we are very excited to welcome him today and have all of his insight as well as his ability to answer all of your questions today. So let's begin. I'll start by introducing you to Steve, which I guess I sort of did. Got a little bit ahead of myself today. And Steve's got a great perspective for us today because he has all of that background in history. He also has been involved in the research community for such a long time. And without actually being the research administrator, he still understands all of the problems that many of us face with business processes and implementing this type of system. So without any further ado, I would like to welcome Steve.
Oh, thank you, Susan, and thanks everyone for attending. As Susan mentioned, I've been doing this for quite a long time. I've been in research admin for 30 some odd years. I had about 15 years at the University of Houston, followed by a 20-year stint at MIT, and now I'm at College Park. So I've been through quite a few years of this, and so hopefully I'll be able to give you a little bit of knowledge and maybe allay some of your anxiety and fears about attempting to move to the cloud. I think many of you, I know we have some COIAS schools on the line. We have some Kuali COIAS schools, sometimes referred to as 521, sometimes referred to as Kuali COIAS. So in the very first background slide up there, you can see the old COIAS thing. That was the old Power Builder application, for those of you who've been around long enough to remember Power Builder. We then took the Power Builder app, turned it into a Java Swing app, and tried to make the Java Swing app look exactly like the Power Builder app. That was the hot technology at the time. Of course, over time, the web started to explode. People wanted something a little bit more web friendly. So we developed something called COIAS Lite. Some schools implemented COIAS Lite, some schools did not, but there was sort of two different flavors of the old MIT legacy COIAS system. At some point in time, Kuali approached MIT and asked MIT if they'd be willing to license their intellectual property to serve as the baseline to create what was then dubbed as Kuali COIAS. Kuali COIAS is sort of a 521. So for those of you that are on 521, you sort of see that Kuali COIAS look and feel, of course, unless you've modified the front end screen and changed the look and feel, but the 521 was supposedly functionally equivalent to MIT COIAS. And functional equivalency basically meant that the core features and functionality that existed in the old MIT COIAS were now present in Kuali COIAS. And then from there, we went on to what we now refer to as Kuali Research. And that's that very bottom screen there where you see the welcome Stephen there. That's the default look and feel if you were to log into what's now known as Kuali Research. So we've been through, this has been a 20-year evolution to get us where we are today. But that's kind of the chain of events that led me up to talking to you folks today. I'm going to talk just a little bit about some stuff that's probably, just sort of obvious anytime you embark on a project like this. But I think it always, is important to spend a couple seconds on this. So obviously, one of the things you want to do as you think about your upgrade path is you need to have some sort of governance structure. When the screen you're seeing now was the governance structure that we implemented at MIT And MIT at that point in time, a few years ago, chose to go on-prem. I would suggest everybody think about hosted from this point on, but that's not to say that you can't do on-prem. MIT had a pretty elaborate governance structure, but they also had many customizations that they wanted folded in and weren't willing to give up. So the point of this slide is not that this is the structure that you need for governance, but it's that you need to have some governance structure. People that can make decisions at the top there's an executive sponsor, basically who's controlling the budget and who are you going to have to answer to if you go over budget. We had functional steering committees so that we could say, well, Kuali doesn't quite do it this way, but they do it this way. Is that okay with you? There was the KC program manager and system manager. There was things looking at the technology, the feeds in and out. There was the program manager from a functional point. Obviously, we had people all over campus in our OSP office, and we had little subgroups that if we had questions about proposal development or the budget or the award group or a faculty working group, because we were affecting faculty, making them all of a sudden, everybody was going to have to do their proposal certifications online. No more signing paper, no more conflict of interest forms on paper. They had to use the system. So regardless of what structure you come up with, you certainly need to think about what makes sense at your own campus to make sure that you have decision making in place when issues arise that need decisions, and you want to make sure also that these are people that can react quickly. You can't wait 3 months for a decision in these kinds of projects. That'll just throw your budget, your timelines, and everything way out of whack. So at Maryland, things differently. We based every week for probably about 16 months, I'm guessing. So we had a weekly meeting with the project staff here at Maryland, and that was joined by 2 or 3, 4 individuals, depending on the topic, from Kuali, as we started to just figure out what in the world was the next step, whether it was what feeds do we need to get in place, what are the pain points, what are our migration issues that we're facing. And so we had weekly meetings with Kuali to discuss the topics and issues and things that had come up that week. Kuali would then debrief us on what had been fixed. And so that was a very important part of our project. We then also met weekly with the College Park administrative staff for change management. College Park, I have to give them credit. They were very open to changing some of their business processes. I think one of the things when you implement a big software package like this is you don't want to try to force it to do things the way you've always been doing it. We actually had a process person come in and look at our processes and say, why are you handing things off 4 times when it looks like you could just do this handoff twice? Sometimes, you get those answers because that's the way we've always done it. That's not a good answer. So really look at this and take the opportunity to do your change management. And sometimes you'll find you'll go, well, all right, there's 50 other schools that do it this way. Why are we the special snowflakes sitting out there that thinks that we're the only ones that have this need? So really take the opportunity and look at your change management. We also then, these were not weekly, but we had system admin meetings. These were important to help the people that are actually going to administer the system. We had to decide on roles, permissions, and groups. When I was at MIT, the people that were going to have to support the campus and support the end users, they decided not to take full advantage and use groups a lot. They decided to kind of brute force roles and permissions. They had their own centralized, what they called the roles database. So we were not going to maintain our roles inside of Kuali. The roles were maintained in an external system that would feed into Kuali research and create all the necessary roles permissions that user needed. That way the departments were maintaining the roles. So if a department wanted somebody to have proposal create role, the department granted that role through the roles database and it would feed through. At Maryland, they maintain all of their roles separately. So we had system admin meetings with Kat and other folks at Kuali to talk about the best practices in using roles, permissions, and groups. So that's something you want to look into on what makes sense for your campus. Obviously, there's workflow. MIT did very custom workflow for every department. Workflow does not migrate. The two systems are so foreign, the way they behave with workflow and RISE and the new terminology and Kuali as core. So there really isn't a migration path. So that is one thing that you're going to have to think about and will be, have to be rekeyed in the new system. Maryland decided to make pretty much every department cookie cutter. It goes from the person to the chair to the dean to the central office, and did not allow for every department to have unique individual workflow. It made setup a lot easier. We were able to use groups and things then that just says the chair signs. Rather than in the MIT model, we had to say Dr. Smith signs because we didn't have the concept and groups of chairs and stuff. So you really want to look at that. The other thing that was very important in the system admin meetings was to look at the parameters. There's tons of parameters in the system. A lot of them, when you first look at them, they're daunting and you're like, oh my God, what is all of this? Just 80% of them, I'm making that number, but it's a huge percentage of them are, you just leave them alone. They're just there for behind the scenes for the software, but there's a lot that control your behavior. Do you want key people to certify? If not, there's a parameter for that. If yes, you flip the parameter one way. So there are tons of parameters, and later in this presentation, there's a link later to show you how to get to all the parameters that you have available. We had lots of meetings with our data warehouse. Many of you have data warehouse. The structure and table structures of the database are different. Kuali research, way back from Kuali COEUS in through Kuali research, Kuali, and I was going to say we because we worked closely with Kuali on a lot of these things when I was still at MIT. We did our best to keep the core sort of database structures the same, the best we could, but there was just things that had to be changed. When we started COEUS at MIT, a desktop computer only had 640K of memory. So we had to make decisions and design decisions based on the fact that somebody might only have 400 or 640K of memory. Those kinds of things are, long gone. So when it made sense, Kuali made changes to the underlying table structures and things, which may affect some of your data warehouse pulls and stuff. Maryland had an additional problem in that we were bringing up a new data warehouse. We were moving from an Oracle on-premise to an Amazon Redshift data warehouse. So we sort of got out in front, and that sort of messed up some of our timing. So you want to think about the impact this is going to have on your data warehouse. Another thing that kind of popped up for us is we had to deal a lot with our HR folks. The Kuali offers, and the next bullet down there, you see that API. So COEUS pretty much relied on batch feeds. Kuali research has a lot of APIs, application programming interface, so that you can sort of start weaning yourself away from the old batch processing and do more real-time things with the APIs. So our person feed from our HR system was going to utilize the API. And we ran into some little bumps. I forget We had 3-digit country code, but Kuali wanted 2, or vice versa. I forget which direction it was. But then we realized that Maryland was not using a standard ISO country table. So we kept looking at records going, why is this person whose address is in Switzerland showing up in China? It was because our country codes were not mapping from our old legacy HR system. So look at your person feeds. You may have some little tweaking, and look at those APIs where you can do this thing more in real time, or utilizing the APIs rather than a bunch of batch processing. And then you've got financial feeds. We have something called bars. We use KFS. So we had to, look closely at all the various feeds and things and decide whether or not those were going to remain batch and whether or not we were going to be able to leverage some of the APIs. One of the things, there's lots of modules. And so this is something that I've done at MIT to try to help us figure out where some of our more pain points would be later as we got into the project. And you can see the color coded. There are some green dots in there, which were heavily customized. So we knew that those were areas that we were going to have to look at. You can see our old friend Ara reporting sitting out there. We said Ara is gone, thank God, hallelujah. So we didn't even have to worry about that. It's a completely deprecated module, and we didn't need to worry about it. And then we also had MIT only things. The proposal review tool in that orange circle, or over in the award, the orange raft thing. That was our research forecasting tool. So we sort of color coded and said, all right, which of these things are pretty much blue out of the box are probably going to be okay. We just need to do some good testing. And where are the places that we have to dig in and find out, are there parameters that will fix this? Is this customization work we have to deal with? And what are these kind of fringe things like the proposal review tool, raft, and other things that we're going to be forced to deal with as our project move forward? Obviously, again, some of this is just standard project stuff, but make sure you identify the certain kinds of risks. Whether your staff leave the project, you have hire consultants who get a better gig and walk off the project. What happens if your development's taking longer? Your warehouse feeds slow you down, or your customization that you thought was minor, Kuali comes back and says, that's 3 weeks worth of work. That's a significant change. So think about those kinds of risks that you need to do. I mentioned before, sometimes to get in front of certain people at your campus that can make decisions, you have to get on the calendar 6 weeks out. So delays in policy and process decisions are certainly something to consider. We always have the feds out there that can jump in and cause us, a nightmare overnight. And competing priorities. I know of a school right now who's trying to get to Kuali in the cloud. And they're also embarking on a new financial system. And their senior folks basically said, if you're not live by X date, your project is done until FY19, because our financial system will take priority over your project. So you have to be done by that time, or you go behind and get in line again. So you'll need to think about what kind of competing priorities you have, and maybe look at how the timing of that works in with some of the larger kinds of priorities that your campus may be working on. So what were some of the surprises that Maryland lives and breathes and dies credit split. We didn't use credit split at MIT, but it was in the MIT base code because many schools used credit splits. And so way back at the MIT days, we programmed in credit splits, which Maryland uses extensively for giving back F&A money to the departments. So it's a very big deal. Unbeknownst to all of us, there was a bug in old COIUS on the credit split window on the award. And what happened is if you are on a sequence, maybe you punch in your first credit split, and then on sequence 3, 4, 5 of that award, you modify the credit split. Behind the scenes, it was deleting the credit split from sequence 1. Since Maryland needed all of the historical pieces, that was a big deal to them that that data was gone when we tried to do our migration. Now, luckily, in our data warehouse, we had snapshots of the way that credit split looked 3 years ago, 5 years ago, 7 years ago. So we were able to reconstruct that. So one of the things that you want to look at as you gear up for your migration is to see if that bug, that old bug in COIUS is going to affect you. There was also some interesting data we saw in the award amount info. That's the old COIUS term, and it's time and money document in your new Kuali research vocabulary. Maryland had converted a lot of awards from their pre-COIUS system, which was called RA. And it looks like some of the data didn't convert correctly all those years ago from RA to COIUS. It also appears that maybe there was a bug sometime in COIUS a long time ago. But anyway, we found some cases where the original entry in COIUS said change amount 0, distributable amount 100,000. Well, how can my distributable go up 100,000 if there was no change amount to cover that? So there seemed to have been some bug years ago in COIUS. I don't remember it, but we found instances of that. So you might want to look and do a sanity check of your award amount info table to see if it needs a little scrubbing prior to your conversion. And I mentioned there some of those awards were converted from a prior system. Something that caught me by surprise, and the bullet there says, what do you mean I can't directly access my database? So as we started getting our first migration run, I immediately said, all right, now give me access to the database so I can start poking around. And Kuali said, no. I was like, what do you mean no? And it's one of those things, my first reaction was, I need to push back on this. What do you mean? It's my data, it's mine, and you can't tell me. It makes a lot of sense. They are responsible in the cloud for your data. If you start poking around and running queries off the wall, have a bad program that gets in an endless loop that brings the system down, you're going to point your finger at Kuali and they're going to, wait a minute, you got all these people in here on this database. How can I be responsible for a database when you're out there messing around with it all the time? So it made total sense after we talked that through. But my initial was like, it caught me by surprise. So what did that mean? We had to jump into our project plan and go, all right, we now need a local copy of our MySQL database. So Kuali defaults to MySQL. When you go into the cloud, you're going into a MySQL database, not an Oracle database. They handle all that conversion and stuff for you. But in order for us to have nightly access to debug and try to figure out what was going wrong, we needed a local copy of the MySQL database. So we had to work with Kuali to have them dump down nightly a copy of our SQL database down to a place that we could access it to bring it back to our campus so that we could have the raw data for debugging purposes or whatever. And that is what is used for our data warehouse folks to do the ETL processes to load our data warehouse. So that is something you want to make sure you consider if you have data warehouses, or if you think you need a local copy for debugging purposes, you need to get those things brought down. The customizations, are they needed any longer? So I mentioned, I showed that slide with all those little circles on it that had all the modules, and we identified certain customizations. I know of working with a few schools and stuff. What they found out is that even like in their 521 instance, not even just old MIT legacy COIUS, but in Kuali COIUS, the 521 instances, they put customizations in there. And Now what they find is that in Kuali research, the latest, greatest offering, they don't need those customizations because they've been folded into the base product now, um, either by a contribution from another school or because that finally bubbled up onto the development cycle of Kuali, and they Kuali put it into base code, and so it's no longer a customization; it's now in base code. I think you all saw the announcement about the $10 million investment from Al Ventures to Kuali. Kuali Research is very favorable in Qualico and at the foundation. They realize we're like the biggest player in town. So I don't know how much of that money we're going to get, but we're going to get a nice share of that money, which we'll be able to fold in more features faster. And so I think it's a perfect time right now because I know Kuali will staff up using some of that $10 million. They'll certainly staff up some more programmers and engineers so that when you have that customization, that you say, you know, how I cannot live without this customization, then you're going to start working with Kuali to figure out how to give that into the base code. And so I'm going to let Susan talk about these last couple of bullets on this slide. Because my friend Lori at Arizona, I think many of you know Lori Schultz, you know, she's a big Kuali player and she's on a 521 instance. She's kind of struggling going, is this customization needed? Because I can't quite configure it and I don't have resources. So Susan, you want to talk a little bit about maybe what Kuali is thinking to help schools with this problem?
Yes, absolutely. We recognize that this is something that many of the schools on older versions are facing, and that it takes time and resources at your institution to be able to boot up and get a sandbox in place and get some of that information transferred over. So what Kuali would like to do to help people in that situation is to make a sandbox for you in the cloud where we can help you configure that information and talk through some of the potential options that you have for your configuration. Again, just in a sandbox situation, a scenario where you would have the chance then to play around and poke around for a couple of months to determine if it feels right or not, so that you have a better informed decision when you need to make that choice about moving forward, and if you want to move forward in the cloud versus on premise, or if Kuali Research is, of course, the right solution for you. So let us know if that's something that's of interest to you. You can contact us at the email that's included in the email that comes out after this webinar and recording of the webinar. And that when we do get that sandbox in place for you, that we would work closely with you, and you could use our Zendesk information resource as a way to contact us and let us know if you're having any challenges or questions about this type of functionality, because Kuali has been for so long a solution for so many different types of schools. There's just such a robust functionality, features that are configurable rather than customizable. So let us know if you would like to pursue that.
Great, thanks. And I strongly urge you to take advantage of that. I think it's great that Kuali is willing to do this. You know, that way you can really start tweaking your own parameters and see, is it really a customization I have to fight for? Or do I just flip this little yes to no and I'm happy to go? So I urge you to take advantage of that. Couple more pain points. I mentioned the sequence number thing. For those of you that use the old MIT COEAS, you know that money and end dates, there are sequence numbers of the sequence numbers. And Maryland, in their reporting strategy for reporting how many awards did we receive this year, what was the value of those awards, Maryland relied on the data always being in line one of a sequence number. So on this screen, you'll see like award sequence 1, line 1, award sequence 2, line 1, 2. So all of Maryland's reporting would always be on line 1. Well, one of the major structural changes between MIT COEAS and Kuali Research is Kuali Research doesn't have sequence numbers of sequence numbers. So one of the things you want to think about is if you are relying on certain positions of these things in some reporting strategies and stuff, you'll want to look at that, or you'll want to look at the impact that not having sequence numbers of sequence numbers may have on your data warehouse or other reporting strategies that you use, because that concept is completely gone in Kuali research. You have all the history and everything. I mean, every one of these entries you see on this screen is in the time and money screens of Kuali research, but there's no sequence numbers of sequence numbers and things like that you can rely on. A little bit on training. These are obviously, a lot of this is standard, but think about your training, how many people you have, whether they're daily, weekly. We did lunch and learns sessions, both at MIT and at Maryland, to invite campus people in to look at things in Kuali, talk about navigation, whether or not you're going to provide on-site proposal. At MIT, we broke the training into 4 basic parts. There was a proposal dev self-directed. So that was just like people in a room, and we gave them a little workbook that says, you know, do these things, and people were sort of on their own with a couple of instructors just walking around helping people navigate and do the things. But there was no talking head standing in front of there. It was all completely self-directed with people knowledgeable in the room to answer questions and help them click the mouse to get them through hurdles. Then there was training for those that do system to system, those of you that do NIH and stuff. You know, there's tons of attachments. So a special training for system to system folks, for non-system to system. And then we had stuff called advanced budget that really got into using some of the, you know, more advanced features in the proposal development module to create proposal budgets. Maryland doesn't track help desk tickets. This chart will be a little bit misleading, but you can see the orange at the top. So our help desk, you know, more than doubled when they went live in May of 2015. So in May of 2014, there was 413 help desk tickets open for MIT COEUS. For 2015, there was 960 help desk tickets. Now, one thing, because I want to mention that these numbers are skewed a little bit. In MIT COEUS, before MIT went live, prop dev was not mandated. When MIT went live in May of 2015, prop dev was mandated. And you had to do prop dev, you had to do routing, no more paper proposals. So a lot of that spike wasn't just because Kuali research is so different. It's because we brought on a whole huge population of people who had never seen the old COEUS prop dev. So everything was foreign to them. All the concepts were foreign. But I think the point here is, you know, plan on some uptick, you know, perhaps in your help desk, and just be aware that, you know, you may have, you know, a little bit response. What went well? The project direction is responding our needs. Kuali was great. I mentioned we had those weekly meetings. We would, you know, say, oh, we've got this problem. They'd say, I'll get back to you Thursday. We'd get an answer on Thursday. We'd say, we need this tweak. They say it'll be ready on Friday. We tested on Friday. It went back and forth. Things went out very well. So that went super well. I was super pleased. Maryland has a project management team. So they actually come out of our libraries, and the tool they like to use is called FreeCamp. So Kuali said, if that's the tool you want to use, we'll learn the tool and we can use that. Many of you use Jira. Kuali uses Jira. So you have options there on how to track your project and the issues and things that you're finding. One of the things we did, took some time, is as a team, meaning Kuali and Maryland, is we mapped out every single little step down to, we need to stop the HR feed on Friday at 9 o'clock. We need to take a database backup And then we tested that, and it's like, that takes 3 hours. Then we said, what is the timing of that move? It takes 4 hours to move our copy of the database to Kuali. How long does it take Kuali to load that database? It takes 23 hours to load the database. So every little detail of what was going to happen, whose responsibility it is, how much time does it take, what's the escalation path if something goes wrong. So as a team, we mapped all that out. It was super useful. We knew exactly what next step was, who was responsible, how long it should take, and all that. I mentioned we used our library staff for the project management role. I think that works nicely. I know some people hate an external project management staff. I think it worked well here because they do have a little bit of distance from the research work. So they don't have really any skin in the game. They're just there to facilitate the project management work. So that went well. Training and go live. 2 days after I wrote Kuali, and I wrote Joel, who's the CEO at Kuali, and just said, this could not have gone any more smooth. When Maryland came up live, I don't know, maybe 15 minutes after we opened it up to the campus, telephone rang. Somebody said, hey, got this little problem. We looked, we called Kuali. 5 minutes later, it was fixed. About 2 hours later, call came in, little problem. 5 minutes later, it was fixed, and that was almost it. Not to say that there wasn't training and some other stuff, but I mean, it could not have gone any smoother. It was just super, super successful implementation. And that's because we all worked together so hard on this. Kuali was super responsive to us. So UMD, needless to say, was very well staffed and very well satisfied. I mentioned the response time was great. Anytime we said, hey, Kuali, how about this? We got lots of yeses. We didn't get a lot of pushback. No, no, no. We got a lot of yeses. The Kuali went well above on our credit split problem, and I'm going to have Susan talk about that in just a minute. But there were certain things in the credit split that, again, we didn't discover that bug. So our data migrated with the dirty data. So now we were having to try to clean up the dirty credit split problem on Kuali, since we didn't clean up that dirty data in COEUS before migration. Kuali was able to script a lot of stuff for us. So I mentioned Maryland had that sequence number and stuff. And because they relied on everything being on line 1, they didn't care so much about a couple of the fields on line 2 as far as dates and stuff. Or there are new date fields in Kuali that weren't there in COEUS. And so we'd say, well, map this to here, map that to there, put this over there. And they did all of that scripting and maintenance work for us. It went great. Kuali did a very good job of being transparent. I don't remember, but maybe once or twice that they said it'll be ready Thursday, and they came back and said, oops, we had a problem. It's not going to be there till Monday. Almost every time. And when the timing was off, it was just off by a day, or they said, we thought it'd be ready on Friday, and we didn't get it till Monday. So it was great. We knew exactly, all right, come Monday, we can test that. It was there, and we were ready to go. We did have a few things on the APIs. We chose to use the APIs to populate our BARS, billings and accounts receivable system. So we found a few issues in some of the APIs, which Kuali worked with us quickly to fix. If you do, start looking at those APIs, start looking at them soon. And Kuali is open to suggestions on how to improve those and make them more useful. I think one of the things that Maryland ran into, since we were one of the first large schools taking advantage of some of the APIs, we uncovered some of the first problems. So hopefully they've all been fixed and you won't even see any of the problems. So I mentioned that credit split thing. So I'm going to ask Susan just to sort of walk you through how that process works.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, so we do have a large team at Kuali, and that some of that team is devoted to customer success, including engineers devoted to the customer success side of things. And we have our development team, which is the group of engineers and product people who come together and move baseline features into the code. And so that was the team that takes on this type of feature addition. So fortunately, University of Maryland began their survey of the landscape here rather early on. And as of April 2016, they identified, not soon after Steve joined Maryland, they identified that there was really a functional gap, not between COIUS and Kuali Research, but in general, that there's this need that when adding someone, any key personnel, particularly in this case, PDPI personnel, but any personnel that's not an employee at the University of Maryland, but was going to be added at one of those key personnel roles that requires credit split, usually, that there needed to be additional functionality around that to say whether or not the person was actually applicable to credit split or not applicable to the credit split functionality, because they did derive their drift off of that. So once that was identified, then we met internally at Kuali and then had some discussions with the University of Maryland to really understand that need, to understand the scope of that need. And then following that, in June, we internally brainstormed and came up with a couple of different solutions. Out of those solutions, ranked which ones would be the best, most complete approach, and then rosed those to the user groups in July 2016. Came to some decisions after some discussion there and began to proceed with initial development in December of 2016. So you'll notice there that I left a gap between those two periods because that was when the OMB forms were released in 2016, and there were 134 forms that were updated, which was super exciting. But I think that to raise the point here that you never know what's going to happen, and therefore it was very helpful that Maryland did identify this early in the process and did talk to us about their needs so that we could still meet their development and have that in place well before their go live in September of last year. So we did the initial development in proposal and did a QA process of that to make sure it was acting and behaving as anticipated, and then carried that forward into institutional proposal and award in February of the following year. So that gives you a sense of the scope and process of features that are determined in your discovery process and what we do as a community so that others in the community also have the ability to weigh in on a customization that was needed or an enhancement that was needed in this case, so that we can make sure that any development is the best for the entire community and not just done with one particular institution in mind. So it was a great collaboration with Maryland and Kuali, and I wanted to give you a sense of what that looked like so that if you encounter that in your transformation, that you would know what to do from there as well.
Great. And thanks, Susan. And you know, that gets back to that point of, you know, you may have customizations. So you want to bring up that, take Kuali, you know, up on their offer for that sandbox so that you can see, you know, has this already been resolved and it's no longer a customization? When it is a customization, go through your change management that says, do we really need this? If the answer is yes, then you come into this process and work with Kuali and say, we can't live without this, and then you'll follow this other path here. So what could we have done better? Sally and some people here at Maryland thought we could have done more testing. I thought they did a great job. I think, you know, some of us were kind of beating ourselves up, like, you know, why didn't we catch that credit split bug earlier? Why didn't, you know, but all in all, we did a lot of testing and things went very good. Obviously you can do, you know, anybody can say you could do more testing. Our data warehouse, I mentioned the problem, what I mean by do better. I mentioned that we were doing a new data warehouse and we were moving to the Amazon Redshift. And they didn't even have the plumbing laid down, but since they knew we were coming up with a new Kuali research and a major upgrade like this, they said it doesn't make sense to change all of the feeds from COIUS to Kuali Research into the old data warehouse. So we sort of got in front of the line and became one of the very first departments to go into the new data warehouse. Well, Steve, being a little naive that Steve is, thought, okay, you know, you have an award table, you have an award PI, you just put those in the new warehouse. What's the big deal? Well, I didn't realize that our new data architects and stuff, they're completely re-envisioning. And Steve's model of the data warehouse is considered old, like stupid old data warehouse, the way you did stuff back in 2000. And that's not the way a modern day data warehouse is structured. Even to the extent, like I'd say, well, can't we do this? And they're like, Amazon doesn't allow you to do things. That's how come it's so freaking fast, is because you can't have procedures, you can't have cursors, you can't do things in an Amazon warehouse model that we could do in an Oracle data warehouse. So the data warehouse thing, it caught me by surprise, and I think we could have done a little bit better. I think I mentioned those the credit split stuff that we didn't find. So I think Kuali in the future should have a little bit more consistency check that says, we ran your first cut of your migration, and we found some inconsistencies between some of things. So in my mind, if it's not, if the front end screens won't allow it to get into the database that way, then the migration script should ensure that all the data gets into the database that way. So that's something, again, the only one I'm aware of really is that credit split problem. But depending on what modules you use and how you've used COIUS over the years, you might see a little bit of something that notifications aren't quite up to what we were hoping. Kuali made several changes, but some of them are in RICE, old RICE, now called Core. So some of the notifications just don't have a lot of information in them. I mean, they tell people they have work to do, but our campus is saying, well, why doesn't it have the title and the PI and the start date and and 28 pieces of data? When it just basically says, you have a new award, and they want a little bit more information. And, again, we found some problems with some of the APIs. Some of the stuff that we were dealing with the financial APIs were things like, Kuali only wants you to hit the API, X number of times per second. If you do a lot of award transactions in a single day, we were exceeding, what was an acceptable number of hits on those APIs. So we had to work with Kuali on some things like that. So look at those APIs. And again, I think Maryland was one of the first schools really utilizing those APIs to the extent we are. So Kuali was having to kind of help us through some of those things. So wrapping it up a little bit here, you're not alone. So the schools over there on the left, those are old COIUS schools that have already migrated. I say migrated, so MIT, Kent State, and College Park, we are all hosted. The University of Maryland, Baltimore is still on premise with Kuali COIUS 521. An interesting project that we are doing now is Maryland has a state law that says College Park and Baltimore sort of need to merge all their systems together. So we are now in the process of actually going to merge the Baltimore 521 and the College Park Kuali Research are all going to be merged into a single instance of Kuali Research. So that project is just getting started. So that'll be interesting for me over the next few years. And we've got California, San Diego, and Irvine are in the process of migrating now. In case you don't know the schools, on the left there are all the hosted schools. So if you want to talk to some schools about their experience with hosted, I'll tell you, it's not as scary as I think a lot of people. People think, I'm losing control. And what do you mean I'm going to get software every week? And, how can I do that? It's not bad, folks. Believe it or not, it's pretty smooth. It's seamless. You really want to pay attention to some of the user groups and stuff. I'll talk about it in a second, but it goes well. But anyway, there's a list of those hosted schools in case you want to contact any of those schools and say, hey, can you talk to me about your your experience with being hosted in the cloud. On the right side over there, I show the on-prem. So BU is on Kuali Research. So that means they're near current. So what I mean by that is they're, sometimes we refer to that as 6.0. So they're an on-premise, they're not in the cloud yet, but they're staying almost up to date with the cloud customers. They might be a month behind or 2 months behind, but they're basically staying up to date, very close to the core product. And by doing that, that eases their transition to the cloud when they're ready to make the transition to the cloud. Then we have COIA schools. KC means a 521 school. So if you're sitting there at 521 and you're thinking you want to move to the cloud or something, those are some of the schools you can talk to about KC. And then at the bottom, I have something that I'm calling hybrid. We have some schools that have some pieces of Kuali local, on-premise, but some of the modules they're now starting to use in the cloud. So Indiana, for example, I think they're using conflict of interest in the cloud, but they're using all the other modules local. So if you're thinking, hey, I can't move everything, but we sure would like that new conflict of interest module because we don't have that thing, and we may as well start right off in the cloud. Contact Indiana because they're doing something like that. And then the last push is, I really hope that people will join as a partner. So partner schools pay a little bit more to sit at the table. I think some of you know this as the executive steering team. Those are the schools that are partner schools. So we're the ones that sort of like, if you've been paying attention to the FDP subaward API. So when I, approached as a partner, I talked to the executive steering team and said, look, the FDP is working on this project. It's a great thing. And we need to move this functionality up in the timeline. So the roadmap is kind of set, but now this thing happened at the FDP, which is really great. And we want to take advantage of that. So we talked about it as a partner. We agreed that that feature, that new subaward thing of the FDP is a great thing to have. And so we asked for Trey, who's at Kuali, to move that up in the timeline. So now Trey will work with Susan and we'll start talking through the user groups over there to the right. So Susan will start taking that to the post-award group and say, hey, look, folks, we're going to need to develop this new little screen. The executive steering committee on the left said this is a priority to do this new subaward thing. So what kind of features do you want to see? What do the screens look like? When do you want it to pop up? When do you want us to do this? So now that will go down to the user groups, go through that process that Susan described. We'll get into the development cycle, and hopefully we will have that as a feature in a few months. So there's a whole ecosystem out there. If you can't afford to play as a partner, being in a user group is free. So get on those user groups, and you get to help set the priorities and work with Susan to help push those roadmaps and when features and functionality are going to come out in the future. So that all said, everybody worked hard. And I mentioned I thought this was one of the most successful projects, and I think it was because Maryland was committed and Kuali was committed. And I don't think Kuali was committed because Steve Dowdy is the father of COIAS. It's because that's just the way they treat their customers. So it's with that investment of new cash and some more engineers coming on, now is the time to jump in and get yourself in the cloud. I think you'll love it. And I think that's about it for me.
Thanks, Steve. That was really wonderful. And you're absolutely right that even though you have great respect and admiration, we have treated all of the customers the same way, that everyone has a say and everyone's business processes are very important. And a lot of times you'll talk to one of the smaller schools and they actually do have very similar processes or a problem as the larger schools too. So I'm glad to hear that it was such a success and that it felt really positive. And again, I want to thank you for taking the time to do this, because hearing you describe it and walk us through what your process was like and problems that were along the way so that others can anticipate those, and that it's given us the opportunity here at Kuali to grow and learn from those and make it a better product is just invaluable, and I really appreciate it, truly. So thank you. And we have a little bit of time squeaking left for any questions. So does anybody here on the call have a question? If you want to just add those into the questions box, then we'll be happy to get back to you. We might not have the ability to get back to everyone today on the webinar call, but if you want to, we will certainly circle back with you on an email to make sure that your questions are answered. So, okay, let me see if we have any questions here. And so it looks like if you could change anything and do your implementation in a slightly different way now after the fact, is there anything different that you would do, Steve?
I think basically the pain points, we started too late in our warehouse and I didn't mention this in the thing, we went through like 3 different iterations of the migration. So Kuali took our data, they migrated it, and we played with it. But we only played with it through the screen because we didn't have our data warehouse ready. Then we did another dry run, Kuali did it, and we played with the screens and things looked okay. And because we didn't have our data warehouse, because we were late getting that running, we didn't see some of the problems that caught us way at the end when we were nearing go live. So I urge you to get those processes up sooner rather than later, because your data warehouse folks look at the data a lot differently, and when they extract that data out, and we started then looking at the data in our warehouse, we were like, oh my God, what's going on here? And we could not see that through the sandbox that Kuali had created for us, because we can't see the tables underneath there. So that's the biggest thing I think we did wrong at Maryland is we didn't have our data warehouse ready to go in time.
Great, thank you. And I have another question here, wondering about the change management processes, and that you went through those both at MIT and at University of Maryland. And did you, not to ask you specifically if one was more successful than the other, but was there anything that was critical to either of those being successful with the change management with the community at those institutions?
Change management at MIT was a little bit different because they were going to go on-prem. And so they had a larger team, and anything that anybody said they had to have, it became where do we slot this into the development, and how much is it going to cost, and are we staying within budget? So their change management was more like gap analysis than change management. There was some change management, like everybody's going to use proposal development. That was a huge change on the campus, but it was more like a dictate that we weren't asking them to change. Well, we were asking those departments to change their process, but we weren't really changing. For those that were already using prop dev, their process didn't change. We were just forcing people that were using Adobe to switch over to system. At Maryland, though, they actually had a team, and they were very good. Like we would say, we're on this cost sharing screen, and Kuali has these 2 fields, and how are we going to use them? And they talked about things, and they were very good about going, we don't really, oh, you know what, that was 8 years ago, the vice president wanted that, and we just keep filling that out, but we don't care. So it was just, as we identified the little subtle differences in the system, or like on the cost sharing screen, there was a contribution by a few schools, so all of a sudden there was some new fields on the cost sharing screen. So we would get together and say, hey, there's these new fields on the cost sharing screen. Should we ignore them, or do we want to take advantage of them? We'd have the discussion, make the decision, and move on.
Thanks, Steve. And it looks like we're just about at time, but I just can't help to squeak in one question from me. So, Steve, out of everything that you've seen in new Kuali research, was there one feature that you really enjoyed the most, was you're most appreciative that was in the system?
One feature the most I enjoy in the system. I'm really, I'm liking the new Medusa now. And that's something that's a parameter. Since I don't use the system every day, I'm not an end user per se of the system. But when I do get in there, generally I'm flipping between awards and proposals and institute proposal and then over to the sub-award module, and I'm flipping back and forth with whatever I'm doing. And so I really like that new look and feel.
Wonderful. Thank you. It's always great to have your feedback, so I appreciate that too. And thank you for joining us today. Thank you all for joining us. We'll be sending out a follow-up email so that you have access to this and can share it with anyone that you think it might be helpful.